Okay. So far, we've seen a fair bit of code, right? In our controllers especially, and then with the number of views and so on we generate and things like that. Of course, we started off with the code in our models themselves, and then in the data folder, we got into our DB context classes, and then initializer and so on. So believe it or not, we've barely scratched the surface. As the term goes on and we keep adding more and more and more stuff, to be honest with you, by the end we're going to have a fairly large amount of lines of code that we put into our application. So good organization is absolutely essential. And there's a few points to talk about here, right? It's crucial for readability, scalability, ease of maintenance, and so on, okay? So it's true, like when there's sort of boilerplate stuff like we've seen in our controllers, yeah, I haven't gone in and extensively documented it. We'll be adding some as time goes on. But right now, we haven't worried about that too much. But there's going to be a lot of work to do to make sure our code is especially easily maintained, that someone can come along, read through our code and understand what it's doing exactly, right? So there are lots of design patterns that address this issue as well. One of the ones I want to talk about a little bit is the single responsibility principle, right? Make sure each method or class has a single responsibility. And that is so ideal, right? Now, trouble is, an overall responsibility sometimes still has different parts to dealing with that responsibility. So, we do get into situations where even following the single responsibility principle, we can only break it down to a certain degree, right? Yeah, if we had a huge monolithic amount of code, well, maybe you can break it down into parts. Even as a quick example, in our demonstration so far, how we created that populate drop-down list little method, right? So instead of having a whole bunch of code repeated throughout our controller, we kind of put most of the work in that one spot, and we just call that reusable chunk of code with its single responsibility, get data ready for drop-down lists, from wherever it's needed inside of the overall controller, right? So that's one example of where we've been trying to put that into place so far, right? Okay. So best practices for sure. Solution project hierarchies, right? Well, fortunately, MVC, as you saw, as soon as we created the application, it was already highly organized with all of our folders for models, views, controllers, and everything else, right? So we want to continue to take advantage of that as much as possible. Why are we making all these subdirectories? Well, of course, that gives us namespace organization as well, okay? Namespaces really help us to logically group related classes, interfaces, and everything else. Layered architecture, okay? Well, basically, that's what MVC is, right? Great separation of concerns. So we don't want to ever move away from that. And in fact, we want to enhance that as time goes on as we're trying to follow best practices. And we've talked a fair bit about dependency injection. We've seen with our services how we can add things that then we can just inject during construction of different objects to allow us to have loose coupling, making our code flexible, testable, etc., right? Naming conventions, sure, right? The fact that we create a controller with a given name, and then the views, the folder for it has the same name as the controller. Then we can just say return view. We don't have to worry about naming the view, et cetera, et cetera. That's just one example of how MVC is following naming conventions, okay? But we're going to do the same thing with naming conventions. We'll continue to use the ones we've talked about for our models and so on as well. Regions. I'll be honest with you. Dealing with regions, that's one of the main reasons why I moved up this discussion to this point in the class, because we're about to start doing a lot more work inside, in particular, of one of our classes. And it's hard to break it up, to justify breaking it up into separate classes. However, it becomes so much code that I usually find that it's best to start creating regions. And of course, comments go along with that. Comments are extremely helpful, right? So those summary comments, just do those the three slashes right above a class and so on, automatically creates a summary comment area for us. And then we can provide information there that shows up in IntelliSense whenever we refer to that class. And it makes our coding much easier, as well as it's self-documenting then for anyone coming along to read of our code as well. So that's another practice we really, really want to make sure we do. But a little bit more about regions, okay? It can be a little controversial. I'll be honest with you about that. But let's talk about pros and cons. Well, maybe I should explain my comment first. So when I say they can be controversial, the main controversy is that, well, if this file is so big that we need to break it up into regions, maybe we should find a way to break it up into separate files altogether, separate classes altogether. Well, that can be an option sometimes, but it isn't always, right? So let's talk about pros and cons. Having regions does definitely improve readability. Okay, we can collapse and expand sections of code, making it easier to navigate large files. Now, wait a second, you're going to say right away, what? We do that already, right? Oh, right? Sure. Okay, anytime I have even a controller open, look at all these little arrows I have and so on. Like I can expand and collapse all these things. I did Control MO to collapse it all down, and I can expand. And that makes it so much more readable. I can, get stuff out of the way, just focus on the one area of the code that I want to at a time. Sure, that's already true. Yes, absolutely. But, okay, regions can allow us to do the same thing in code that doesn't have that already, right? Logical grouping. By grouping related code together, regions can help organize our code for sure, okay? And collaboration. If you are working with a team of other developers, which is going to come more next term when you're doing your actual community-sponsored project course, but even right now, if you're working in your teams in your project planning course, right, you might find it useful there as well. Regions can help other developers understand the structure of your code more quickly, right? Con, some developers argue they can hide poorly structured code that should be refactored instead, right? Okay, fair enough. So we'll try to be careful. We don't want to overuse regions, but I do believe we will see that in some circumstances they are an excellent way to organize our code. Okay, so when should we use them? Even adhering to the single responsibility principle, it can be helpful to divide large sections of code into smaller chunks or regions, right? Really not always practical to break it up into totally separate objects or separate classes and things like that, but at least giving regions gives us some organization to the structure, right? We definitely don't want to overuse them. And, as I said, our blocks of code already often collapse in neat single lines and so on and so forth, okay? We do want to use them occasionally when a logical separation of steps to complete a task. I'll emphasize that again. When there's steps to complete a task that are logically kind of separated from each other, we do this first, then we want to do this, and then we want to deal with this. And it's all part of one process, right? Hard to always break that up if it's one process, but breaking up into these little sort of chunks or tasks can make sense, okay? And the example we're going to be spending quite a bit of time with over the coming week is that code we started to write for initializing the database, right? Now, if all the data was going to come from other sources, that's great, right? But, in the code first development, the way we're doing it, we cannot really get away without an initializer class. And we always benefit tremendously from having some seed data in place. Okay, so let's talk a bit about how that regions can work inside of our initializer class. Okay, this is one that tends to grow and grow during the development process. In fact, probably students spend more time kind of wasted fighting with the code in here because they didn't organize it very well from the beginning than any other single file or chunk of code in the whole course that we're going to be dealing with, right? So this is kind of coming from watching students painfully working their way through all the seed data that they have to produce and so on over time, right? So I like to suggest making some regions inside of your initializer, right? First of all, the first region is to prepare the database, right? Check if it exists. Do you need to drop it and recreate it? Okay. Do you need to apply migrations, right? We'll look at ways we can write some excellent logical tests and so on to decide. And we'll also look at creating some parameters that you can pass in to indicate, hey, initializer, this time around, I want you to drop and recreate everything from scratch, or no, we don't have to do that. I'll pass a different parameter value, and then you don't have to recreate it. We can just maybe apply migrations or not, et cetera, right? but we'll put all that into one region at the top of our initializer class. Then in terms of seeding data, okay, I've mentioned this quickly before, but in terms of the data that we have in the application, there's some data that we're always going to want in production as well as during development, right? So I often put that in a region by itself, okay? Seeding required data, data we need to be in the database no matter what, now during development and later on in production as well, right? It's all meaningful data. It's data that really is real world, you might say. So, I think example I've given before is, you're going to have, a spot where you're filling out addresses for shipping or receiving or whatever, right? And you need a drop-down list of regions or provinces, territories, whatever. Well, you need that during production as well as during development. So things like that, data that's going to stay in there even when this app is up and running, we'll get that seeded first, right? Then in a third region, right, we can seed some meaningless, useless, not significant, however you want to put it, sample data, right? This is data that is not going to be there when we're rolled out into production. It's just garbage data just to help us during development, because it's awfully hard to, worry about, how does the screen look in this, situation? Well, if you have only one record or even a couple records to show, how can you really tell? Sometimes you need dozens of records to be able to see what it really looks like and what the flow looks like as you go through from, one view to another and so on and so forth. But this makes sense to keep it in a third region, because we can simply, as we pass parameters into our initializer, indicate whether or not we want to seed the sample data right now or not, right? So we'll keep it separate. Okay, so again, that's a quick discussion. I'm largely covering these types of discussions in preparation for going ahead with our next steps in development. Okay, I'm just going to pause for any questions we have at the moment. Let me just close that for now.